cardiovascular system includes the heart, which is a muscular pump that contracts rhythmically to move blood around the body. The blood vessels, which is a system of tubes through which the blood flows, and the blood itself, which provides a medium for which oxygen, nutrients, and other molecules can be transported around the body. The cardiovascular system is critical to survival, as it is the body's transportation network. It's similar to a road system within a country. Today we're going to discuss the anatomy of the heart, the major functions of the cardiovascular system, the layers of the heart, blood flow through the heart, circulatory systems, blood vessels structure and function, venous return mechanisms, the cardiac cycle, and the intrinsic and extrinsic regulation of heart rate, and we'll finally end with the blood pressure. The cardiovascular system's major functions is to deliver oxygen and fuel to the tissues, the removal of carbon dioxide and other metabolic waste products from the body, to transport hormones from the site where they are produced or secreted to their sites of action, the target tissue, to maintain temperature balance, to regulate fluid, and the body's pH, so referred to as the acid-base balance. It plays a role in the immune function by helping to prevent infection from invading organisms. The heart itself is a hollow, four-chambered muscular organ which pumps blood to the lungs and to general circulation. The heart's four chambers include the upper chambers of the right and left atria, or singular atrium, and the lower chambers of the right and left ventricles. These chambers are distinct and are separated by walls called the septa. The atria are thin-walled, they're low-pressure chambers that store blood before it enters the ventricles. The smaller right ventricle pumps blood to the lungs, while the larger, more muscular left ventricle pumps blood into the aorta, which is the major artery of the body. The heart comprises of three layers. The outer layer, the pericardium, is a tough membranous sac that encases the heart. The space between the pericardium and the external surface of the heart is filled with pericardial fluid, and this fluid functions to reduce the friction between the pericardial membrane and the heart as it beats. The middle layer is known as the myocardium, and this is composed of the heart or cardiac muscle. The inner layer is the endocardium, and this is composed of squamous epithelial cells. This inner layer is continuous with the inner lining of the arteries, as we'll see in a few slides' time. The myocardium, the cardiac muscle fibers, are connected by what's called intercalated discs. These discs enable the myocardium to contract as a single unit. The discs have desmosomes, which are structures that hold the cells together to prevent the cells being pulled apart during the contraction of the heart, and gap junctions, and these allow a rapid transmission of the action potential or nervous impulse that signals the heart to contract as one unit. The blood vessels. The cardiovascular system has three types of blood vessels: arteries, which in turn lead to arterioles, which in turn lead into capillaries. Capillaries are where nutrient and gas exchange occurs. The capillaries lead into venules, and they form the larger veins. Blood is carried away from the heart in the arteries. These branch into narrower blood vessels called the arterioles. The arterioles lead into the network of microscopic blood vessels called capillaries, and the capillaries merge to form venules, which in turn form veins. All the blood vessels share features, but each has its own characteristics. For example, all blood vessels have a hollow interior through which blood flows. This is called a lumen. The inner lining of the lumen consists of the endothelium, which consists of endothelial cells. This provides a smooth surface that minimizes friction so the blood can flow through more easily. So let's have a closer look at the arteries and the veins in particular. The arteries are muscular tubes that take blood away from the heart. They consist of 3 layers. The inner lining or inner wall consists of the endothelium. The middle layer consists of an elastic fiber. This allows the vessel to stretch as a result of a wave of blood following contraction of the heart and then to return to shape afterwards. It also consists of smooth muscle, which allows the artery to contract and relax. The outer layers is composed of connective tissue. This gives arteries their strength and anchors it to surrounding tissue. The elastic fiber of the middle layer helps the artery cope with the pressure shock, i.e. the large increases in pressure that accompanies each heart contraction. And it allows us to maintain a relatively even pressure despite large changes in the volume of blood passing through the arteries. The smooth muscle of the middle layer contracts to reduce the diameter of the lumen. We call this vasoconstriction, and this reduces blood flow. While when the smooth muscle relaxes, the lumen expands. This is what we call vasodilation, and blood flow is increased. This vasoconstriction, vasodilation, allows the body to regulate the distribution of blood and adjust to meet the demands, the metabolic demands of the body. Any weakness in the artery walls can result in serious problems. For example, they can result in aneurysms, which is a bulge in the blood vessel. This is where the artery balloons out at its weakest point as blood pressure builds higher and higher within it. We can also get lesions of the inner layer of the arteries, and this can lead to atherosclerosis, which is a major cause of heart disease. These arteries form the arterioles, and the arterioles are barely visible to the naked eye, and they consist of the same 3 layers. However, the middle layer is mostly smooth muscle, not much elastic fiber, and the outer layer is much thinner. The arterioles have 2 important regulatory functions. One, they're the main controller of blood pressure. When the smooth muscle of the arterioles contract, blood pressure increases, and when we have a larger number of arterioles contracting, the greater the increase in blood pressure. The opposite is also true, so when the arterioles relax, blood pressure is much lower, and the more arterioles that relax, the lower the blood pressure. The second regulatory role is that arterioles are the gatekeepers to the capillary networks. They control the flow of blood into the capillary networks. The arterioles open and close the capillaries, and they open and close the capillaries depending on the metabolic needs of the body. By closing off a particular capillary bed, that's a capillary network in a particular area, blood is redistributed to another part of the body. So for example, at rest, the capillary beds around the digestive organs may be open, but when we start to exercise, they close and blood is redistributed to the working muscles. Capillaries are microscopic blood vessels that connect the arterioles to the venules. They function in the exchange of materials between the blood and the body. They are only 1 cell thick. This helps substances to move more easily between the blood and the extracellular fluid. This is the fluid around the cells outside of the capillaries. The plasma membrane of the capillaries consists of endothelial cells, and these provide an effective and selective barrier to allow substances into the capillaries. However, some substances that can't pass through the endothelial cells, they can pass through slits between the cells of the capillaries, the capillary wall. The amount of blood flow through the capillaries can be adjusted to meet the demands of the body for oxygen and nutrients to that particular region of the body. A network of capillaries in a particular area is called a capillary bed, and there could be 10 to 100 capillaries per bed. We can see in the image that the precapillary sphincter controls blood flow from the arterioles into the capillary bed. These operate like valves, and when the valves contract, the capillary beds are shut off, and when they relax, the capillary beds are opened. Capillaries have a huge surface area, and this allows rapid exchange between the body and the blood. Only one red blood cell at a time can pass through. This allows, especially it allows a slow rate of flow, so that there's increased amount of time for the exchange of materials to occur. So, for example, at the lungs, between the alveoli and the capillaries, the exchange of oxygen, there's more time for oxygen to transfer to diffuse from the alveoli into the capillaries. Let's have a look at the veins now. So we know that the venules turn into veins, and these return the blood back to the heart. There are some structural similarities between the arteries, but there are important differences. They have the same 3 layers, but the walls are much thinner in the veins, and the lumens of the veins are larger than arteries of an equal size. The thin walls and the larger lumens of the veins allow them to hold a large volume of blood. They act as blood reservoirs. So, for example, 65% of the body's blood supply are in the veins at any one moment. In arteries, contraction of the heart creates a high pressure to help keep blood flowing through. However, in the veins, blood pressure is much lower. So for blood to return to the heart without this pressure, we need certain mechanisms. For blood returning to the heart from the head and neck, gravity will help. But in the lower body, the blood must move against the force of gravity. There are 3 mechanisms in which blood will move from the lower part of the body to the heart especially. As we can see in the structure of the veins, that the veins have valves. And valves prevent any backflow in blood. It's a one-way system, if you like. The second mechanism is the contraction of the skeletal muscle that surrounds the veins. So the skeletal muscle surrounding a vein will contract, and this squeezes the nearby vein. This pressure pushes the blood past the valve and towards the heart. It's a little bit similar to a tube of toothpaste. When you squeeze a tube of toothpaste, the toothpaste comes out the end. It's a similar mechanism involved with the skeletal muscle pump. The third mechanism is called the respiratory pump. When we breathe, this causes a change in pressure that helps to move blood towards the heart. In this case, the thoracic cavity increases in size when we inhale. This causes the pressure within the thoracic cavity to decrease. In turn, the pressure within the abdominal cavity increases. And as we know, blood will move from an area of will move from an area of high pressure to an area of low pressure. So the higher pressure in the abdominal cavity forces blood into the lower pressure of the thoracic cavity and towards the heart. So in effect, the lower pressure in the chest cavity with each breath pulls the blood back towards the heart. Also, the increase in pressure in the abdominal cavity squeezes the veins nearby, and this also forces blood towards the heart. Next, we'll look at the circuits of blood flow. And as we've seen in the structure of the heart, that the heart is separated into left and right hand sides. The heart consists of two separate pumps, one on the left and one on the right. This arrangement prevents blood with high concentrations of oxygen mixing with blood that's low in oxygen. The right side of the heart transports blood low in oxygen from the heart to the lungs, and blood that's rich in oxygen back from the lungs to the heart. So the right hand side of the heart we call the right hand pump we call the pulmonary circuit or pulmonary circulation. On the left hand side, the left pump, we call the systemic circulation or the systemic circuit. So let's have a look at the pathway of blood through the heart. So blood that's low in oxygen will return from the body back to the heart via the inferior vena cava in the lower part of the body and the superior vena cava from the upper part of the body. And blood will enter the right atrium. From the right atrium, blood will pass through the tricuspid valve and into the right ventricle. From the right ventricle, blood is ejected from the heart through the pulmonary semilunar valve. From there, it will enter the pulmonary arteries, and that blood low in oxygen will be taken to the lungs. It's important to note that these are the only arteries in the body that have blood low in oxygen. So from the lungs, the blood receives oxygen, and that oxygenated blood will return back to the heart via the pulmonary veins. From the pulmonary veins, the blood will enter into the left atrium. The left atrium, the blood will pass through the mitral valve or the bicuspid valve into the right ventricle, the left ventricle. From the left ventricle, blood is ejected out of the heart through the aortic semilunar valve and into the aorta. And the aorta is the major artery of the body. From there, this blood rich in oxygen is taken to the rest of the body. It's important to note that the heart has its own circulation system also, called a coronary circuit or coronary circulation. Now, this is an extensive network of blood vessels that provide nutrients and, importantly, oxygen to the cells of the heart, the myocytes. The coronary artery branches, which supplies the heart with its blood supply, branches off the aorta immediately after the aortic semilunar valve. This means that the heart receives blood that is only just returned from the lungs and therefore is rich in oxygen. The blood returns to the heart via the coronary veins. The coronary arteries are vitally important in health. Any blockage or narrowing of the coronary arteries will result in a shortage of oxygen reaching the myocardium. This can result in angina pectoris, which it's chest pain, and if this isn't treated, if the narrowing or blockage of the coronary artery isn't treated, this can result in a myocardial infarction. This is the medical term for a heart attack. This is where heart cells die as a result of not receiving enough oxygen. This results in the heart being unable to function sufficiently as a pump and can result in death. Although we talk about the two separate pumps of the heart, the two sides of the heart work in tandem. The atria and ventricles contract simultaneously. Each heartbeat involves a contraction phase, known as systole, and a relaxation phase, known as diastole. The events associated with the flow of blood through the heart chambers during a single heartbeat is known as the cardiac cycle. So let's have a look at the cardiac cycle in a little bit more detail. The first stage, all chambers of the heart relax and blood passes through the atria and enters the ventricles through the AV valves. When the ventricles are 70% filled, the atria contract, and this pushes the remaining contents of the atria into the ventricles. This is known as atrial systole. During this atrial systole, the ventricles are relaxed, and this is known as ventricular diastole. This takes about 0.1 seconds. After this phase, the atria relax, which is known as atrial diastole. And now it's the turn for the ventricles to begin their contraction phase, known as ventricular systole. When the ventricles contract, blood is ejected from the heart. And upon completion of this contraction, the heart relaxes again to begin the cardiac cycle again. The cardiac cycle is controlled intrinsically via specific and specialized structures within the heart. These structures guarantee that the chambers of the heart contract in a specific order so that the blood moves in the correct direction through the heart towards the lungs and in the systemic circulation. Cardiac muscle tissue, along with some specialized nervous tissue innervating the myocardium, is capable of initiating its own impulse for contraction. This ability to initiate its own impulse is termed autorhythmicity. The tempo of the cardiac cycle is controlled by the sinoatrial node, or the SA node. This is a specialized cluster of cardiac muscle cells located in the upper right atrium near the junction of the superior vena cava. The sinoatrial node is also termed as the pacemaker, as this is the specialized cluster of cells that initiate the nervous impulse. The sinoatrial node sends a signal about 70 times a minute for the average person, depending on factors such as fitness and genetics. The sinoatrial node sends out an electrical signal that spreads through the muscle cells of the atria, causing them to contract, and they contract simultaneously. From there, the signal reaches another cluster of specialized muscle cells called the atrioventricular node, or the AV node. And this is located in the partition between the two atria. The AV node receives the signal, and this delays it just enough to allow the ventricles to fill. It then relays the stimulus by means of specialized cardiac muscle fibers called atrioventricular bundle. And this runs along the walls between the ventricles, or the septum. The bundles fork out into the right and left branches, and then divide into many specialized cells called Purkinje fibers. These Purkinje fibers penetrate the walls of the ventricles. They allow a rapid spread of the impulse, and this ensures that the cells of the ventricles contract simultaneously. However, sometimes the system becomes faulty, and cells contract independently, and this results in a rapid, irregular contractions of the ventricle, called ventricular fibrillation. This renders the ventricles useless as pumps, and circulation stops. Death can occur unless the heartbeat is restored. This is usually done through the application of an electrical shock to the heart, what we'll know as defibrillator. A defibrillator is used, and this often restores the sinoatrial function back to normal. Sometimes an artificial pacemaker is needed, and this is an implant that's just below the skin and which monitors heart rate and the rhythm of the heart rate, and it responds to any abnormalities. The electrical events that spread through the heart with each contraction can be measured via an electrocardiogram, or an ECG. This involves placing electrodes on the body surface, and these electrodes can detect the electrical events during the cardiac cycle. They can transmit them so that they cause deflections or movements in the tracing made by a recording device. The ECG is that image of the electrical activities of the heart generated by the recording device. Within the ECG, the height of a wave represents the amount of electrical activity, and indirectly represents the amount of myocardium contracting or relaxing. The horizontal length of the wave represents time, so the shorter length of the wave, the shorter period of time for that wave to occur. So if we look at our trace, we can see that the first deflection or wave is the P wave, and this represents atrial contraction or atrial systole. There is a period of time, approximately a tenth of a second, during which there's no electrical activity. As we can see, this is a flat line on the ECG trace. After which begins the Q or S complex, and this represents the contraction of the ventricles, or ventricular systole. We can see that this is a much greater height, so therefore represents greater electrical activity and greater amount of myocardium contraction. After the Q or S complex is the T wave, and the T wave represents ventricular relaxation and repolarization. An ECG is typically can be used to determine heart rate. However, it is also used to evaluate whether the heart is functioning normally or whether some abnormality exists. In addition to the intrinsic control, extrinsic control, that's control from outside of the heart, occurs and is responsible for adjustments in heart rate. The parasympathetic nerve fibers that innervate the sinoatrial and the atrioventricular nodes arise from the cardiorespiratory control center in the brain. This is called the medulla oblongata, and they reach the heart as part of the vagus nerve. At the sinoatrial and atrioventricular nodes, the parasympathetic nerve fibers release acetylcholine, which decreases the activity of both nodes, and this results in a decrease in heart rate. An increase in parasympathetic stimulation, therefore, results in a decrease in heart rate. while the removal of parasympathetic stimulation results in an increase in heart rate. The dominance of the parasympathetic system at rest is particularly obvious in athletes with training-induced bradycardia. That's a slowing of the heart rate. And the resting heart rate of these athletes can be as low as 35 beats per minute. Sympathetic nerve fibers, they reach the sinoatrial and atrioventricular nodes and the myocardium as part of the cardiac accelerator nerves. At the sinoatrial and atrioventricular nodes, the sympathetic nerve fibers release norepinephrine. Norepinephrine is sometimes called noradrenaline. This norepinephrine increases the activity of both nodes, and this results in an increase in heart rate. Norepinephrine also acts to increase the force of the myocardial contraction. This means that there's an increase in the amount of blood that can be pumped with each beat of the heart. Besides the direct neural influences, the endocrine changes, so that's hormonal changes, can also alter heart rate. For example, epinephrine, or otherwise known as adrenaline, released by the adrenal gland into the bloodstream, acts to increase heart rate. This only occurs when the adrenal gland is stimulated by the sympathetic nervous system. So, increased sympathetic activity results in an increase in heart rate, whereas the removal of sympathetic stimulus decreases heart rate. So we can see that heart rate depends on a balance between parasympathetic and sympathetic stimulation. One example of this is when we start to exercise. And when we start to exercise, there's an increase in heart rate. And one might think that the increase in heart rate is as a result of increased sympathetic activity. However, most of the evidence reveals inconsistencies in the response of sympathetic nervous system and points more to a removal of parasympathetic stimulation. So the increase in heart rate at the beginning of exercise is more likely due to the removal of parasympathetic stimulation rather than an increase in sympathetic stimulation. As we start to exercise and heart rate continues to increase, then sympathetic stimulation increases. And this is the result of an increase in heart rate as exercise progresses. Blood pressure is the force exerted by the blood against the blood vessel wall. In the case of arterial blood pressure, it's the force applied by the blood to the arterial walls. Systolic and diastolic blood pressure refers to the highest pressure occurring during systole and the lowest pressure during diastole, respectively. Ideally, blood pressure should be great enough to circulate blood, but not so great it creates stress for the heart and blood vessels. Arterial blood pressure is measured within the brachial artery using a sphygmomanometer or a blood pressure cuff and a stethoscope. Normal values for blood pressure would be a systolic blood pressure around 120 or less, and a diastolic blood pressure around 80 or less. The units are millimeters of mercury. What's termed pre-high blood pressure, or the name given to high blood pressure is hypertension, so pre-hypertension, is a systolic blood pressure between 121 and 139 and a diastolic blood pressure between 81 and 89. Somebody would be considered hypertensive or have high blood pressure if they had a systolic blood pressure above 140 and a diastolic blood pressure above 90. Somebody might be considered hypotensive, so with low blood pressure, if they had a systolic blood pressure at or below 90. Many factors influence blood pressure, such as gender, age, the time of day, the physical activity levels, stress, and other lifestyle factors. It should be noted that blood pressures around in different areas of the peripheral circulation are different from that of the brachial artery. The highest blood pressures can be found within the ventricles during systole, and the lowest blood pressures can be found within the ventricles during diastole, so when the ventricles relax. Blood pressure can also influence blood flow, because blood flow is equal to a change in pressure divided by the resistance to flow. An increase in blood flow can be achieved by increasing the difference in pressure between two areas. Because as we know, blood will go from an area of high pressure towards an area of low pressure. Increased blood flow can also be achieved by decreasing the resistance to flow. The greatest pressure differences occur within the capillaries because the radius of these blood vessels is so small, about a radius of one red blood cell. This pressure difference between the arterioles and the capillaries allows a greater blood flow into the capillaries. Another important cardiovascular measure is the mean arterial pressure. And this is the average pressure that drives the blood into the tissues throughout the cardiac cycle. The mean arterial pressure is defined as the diastolic pressure plus a third the difference between systolic and diastolic pressures. You can see the equation on the slide.